away from that snowblower right now, sir, or I will have you cited for trespassing. You knew she was here.
Careful. That strip by the curb's still bad. I haven't reached it yet.
I don't need safety tips from the man running heavy equipment on my mother's property at 11 o'clock at night.
Ma'am, I'm almost finished. 2 more minutes and this driveway's clear.
I don't care how close you are to finished. This is private property, and I don't know who you are.
Nobody sent me here. I do this every storm. Every house on Halden Street has been for 2 winters running.
That's not an answer, that's a slogan. You understand what almost just happened to me? On ice you hadn't gotten to yet?
Municipal code lets me fine you $350 per incident for exactly this. I've never once slipped on a step I cleared myself. Something moved across his face, there and gone before she could read it. That's sort of the whole point of doing it. I just haven't cleared that part yet. You still haven't told me who you are, or who authorized this. Nobody has to authorize kindness, ma'am. Last I checked. That's a nice thing to say standing on somebody else's property at 11 at night. She folded her arms, shivering despite herself. I need a name, at minimum, before I decide whether to call this in. Declan Morrow. He said it plainly, no challenge in it. You can call whoever you want. I'll still be back after the next storm. She didn't recognize him. Not his face, not his name, not the fact that 8 months earlier she had signed the budget line that ended his job with the very department whose sidewalks he was clearing for free tonight. She only knew a strange man had appeared out of a whiteout at 11 o'clock, running a snowblower over her elderly mother's front walk like the house belonged to him. I need you to stop, she said. Tonight. For good. With respect, ma'am, I'm not stopping until the porch light goes off. She looked past him at the house and understood slowly that he meant the actual light, glowing yellow above the door, the only warm color for a block in either direction. The porch light, she repeated, like the words didn't fit together the way he'd used them. It means somebody's still up. Still needs the walk clear. He shrugged, already turning the engine back on. When it goes dark, I know I'm done for the night. She had no idea, standing in that driveway arguing with a stranger about liability, that the porch light hadn't gone dark on her mother's house in 2 winters, and that the man in front of her was the entire reason why. Thornbury was the kind of small town that showed up on maps, mostly because of the river running along its eastern edge. A mill town 2 generations removed from the mills, now held together by a hospital, a community college satellite campus, and a downtown of half-occupied storefronts that everyone kept insisting was on the verge of a comeback. It got real winters, the kind that closed schools and turned Halden Street into a single unbroken sheet of white by midnight. Declan Morrow had grown up on weather like this. He'd spent 19 years behind the wheel of a city plow before the layoff, and he still woke at the first sound of sleet against the window the way other men woke to alarm clocks. He was 41 now, raising his son alone in the house he and his late wife had bought when Jasper was 2, back when the mortgage felt survivable and the future felt like something you could actually plan for. Jasper was 8, missing both front teeth, prone to asking exactly the question adults were hoping to avoid. Fiona Morrow had died 2 winters ago, on their own front walk, 20 feet from the porch light she'd always kept burning for him. She'd been the one who started it. Every night he worked the late plow route, she left the porch light glowing so he'd see it from 3 houses down, so the last stretch of a 16-hour shift ended with something warm waiting instead of a dark house. You don't have to do that every night, he told her once. Coming in past midnight, snow still melting off his boots. I know the way home. I've lived here 4 years. It's not about you finding the house, Declan. She'd been curled on the couch with a book she wasn't reading, waiting up the way she always did. A porch light doesn't ask who's coming home. It just stays on. That's the whole point of it. That's a strange thing to be sentimental about. Everything worth doing looked strange from the outside. She'd pulled him down onto the couch beside her, cold coat and all. Someday you'll understand why I do it. You'll probably do it for somebody else. He hadn't understood it then. He understood it completely now. 2 years too late to tell her so. Grief, he'd learned, didn't arrive the way people described it before it happened to you. Not a wave, not a storm, nothing that announced itself and passed. It was more like weather that moved into the house permanently and simply became part of the climate you lived in. Some days it sat quiet in a corner. Other days it filled every room at once, usually without warning, usually triggered by something as small as a smell or a song or, In his case, the particular color of light a bulb threw against fresh snow. He had built an entire nightly ritual out of the one habit of hers he could still perform on her behalf, because it was easier to carry her forward that way than to simply let the habit die along with her. The night it happened, the city plow route ran long, a storm nobody predicted, roads that needed clearing before the morning commute, and Fiona went out to get the mail at the end of a long, exhausting day alone with Jasper, and the walk hadn't been salted, and the ice underneath the snow didn't announce itself the way ice is supposed to. She went down hard. Nobody found her for 40 minutes. By the time Declan got the call and got home, she was already in an ambulance, and 4 days after that, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and vending machine coffee, she was gone. He made a promise to himself at her funeral that he never said out loud to another living soul, not even Jasper. Nobody on this street is ever going down on ice I could have cleared. He didn't know, making that promise, that 8 months later the city would eliminate his job in a budget vote, or that he'd keep the promise anyway, on his own gas money, with a used snowblower he'd bought off a neighbor for $200. "Why do you do the whole street, Dad?" Jasper had asked him once, watching from the window in his pajamas. "Not just our house?" "Because your mom used to leave the light on for me," Declan told him. "So now I leave the driveways clear for everybody else's mom. Same idea, different direction." Jasper had thought about that with his whole face, the way 8-year-olds do, and hadn't asked again. Sad. Mayor Adrienne Colfax had been in office 16 months, elected on a single promise that Thornbury's finance director wrote onto every campaign flyer. Responsible budgets, no more surprises. The town had come within one bad quarter of insolvency under the previous administration, a fact Adrienne had built her entire political identity around fixing, and a fact she carried the way some people carry a stone in their shoe, never quite able to walk normally around it. She was 46, unmarried, the kind of tired that didn't show up in her face until she was alone in the car. 8 months into her term, facing a budget shortfall she hadn't invented but had inherited, she'd sat across a conference table from her finance director and her chief of staff, Naomi Doran, staring at a spreadsheet that had exactly one uncomfortable answer in it. "So, we cut the seasonal snow crew from 6 drivers to 2, and we make it back in 11 weeks, the finance director had said, sliding the numbers across the table like they settled something. "It's the single largest discretionary line we've got left that isn't a union contract. Those 6 drivers have families," Naomi said. "Some of them have been doing this for 15, 20 years. So did the people who lost the library's Saturday hours last spring," the finance director said. "Every cut has a face on it, Naomi. That's not a reason not to make it." Adrienne had listened to both of them and said almost nothing, because the number on the page was real, and the shortfall was real, and she had run for this office promising exactly this kind of unpopular arithmetic. She signed the cut that afternoon. "You cut 6 drivers to 2 in the middle of a snow season," Naomi told her afterward, in the hallway, her voice low enough that no one else could hear it. "And I signed every one of those layoff letters myself. I'd like it on record that I think we're going to regret this." "Noted," Adrienne said, and moved on to the next meeting, because that was the only way she knew how to survive a budget decision without remembering her father's name. Her father, Gareth Colfax, had worked public works maintenance for the city of Thornbury his entire adult life. 22 years ago, on a routine repair call, a piece of equipment failed that should have been retired 3 budget cycles earlier. A hoist the department had kept limping along because the money for a replacement had been quietly redirected to cover a shortfall nobody wanted to admit out loud. Gareth Colfax died on a Tuesday afternoon because the town had decided in small invisible increments that maintaining what it already had cost less than admitting what it actually needed. Adriana was 24 when it happened. She had spent every year since convinced that the softest, kindest sounding budget decisions were the ones that killed people slowest. She ran for mayor on the promise that Thornbury would never again let sentiment override arithmetic. She had never once considered that the arithmetic itself might be the thing doing the killing this time. Naomi Warren was 33, sharper than her job title suggested, and had spent 8 months privately keeping a folder of names, the people the budget cuts had actually touched, that she never showed anyone, including herself, on the nights she felt like giving up on the whole job. She had written Declan Morrow's name into it the day she typed his layoff letter, mostly because something about his personnel file, 19 years without a single disciplinary note, had stuck with her longer than the others. The story made the Thornbury Gazette 3 weeks after Declan lost his job, buried on page 6 under a headline that undersold the anger it generated among people who actually plowed their own driveways for a living. City trims seasonal snow budget, cities fiscal discipline. Adrienne answered questions about it at a town hall the following Thursday, standing at a podium in the Thornberry Community Center under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little sick. 6 drivers down to 2 isn't a number I chose lightly, she told a room of maybe 40 residents, most of them older, most of them worried about exactly the kind of storm that hadn't come yet. It's the number the budget allowed without cutting somewhere that would have hurt more people. Easy to say from behind a podium, a man near the back called out. Harder when you're the one shoveling your own mother's walk at midnight because nobody's coming. Adriana didn't have an answer that satisfied the room, and she knew it. She thanked everyone for coming, took 2 more questions she deflected competently, and drove home that night, turning her father's name over in her head the way she always did when a decision started to feel like it might cost someone something she couldn't undo. She did not yet know that a man in the audience that night, quiet, near the door, arms crossed, had been one of the 6 drivers she was talking about, and that he'd left before the meeting ended without asking her a single question because he'd already decided what he was going to do about it, with or without her permission. The morning after that driveway confrontation, Halden Street looked like nothing had happened, which was exactly the kind of quiet Declan had built his whole ritual around. Nobody on the street knew his name except as the Plow guy, a fact he preferred. Recognition wasn't the point. The point was nobody waking up to a car they couldn't dig out of, or worse, a walk they couldn't safely cross. Jasper came out in his boots before school, breath fogging, and helped his father salt the last few steps with a coffee can and a plastic scoop sized for a kid's hands. Mr. Bickford says thank you every time, Jasper reported, nodding at the house on the corner. He waves from the window. He can't come out much anymore. That's enough thanks right there, Declan said. You don't do a thing like this for the wave. You do it so the wave's even possible in the first place. What if nobody ever says thank you? Then you still did it. He handed Jasper the empty coffee can to carry. Some of the best work anybody ever does. Nobody claps for. That doesn't make it less worth doing. The mayor lady yelled at you last night. Declan glanced down at his son, surprised. You were supposed to be asleep. I heard the car door. Jasper shrugged, the universal shrug of a kid who knows more than the adults think he does. Was she mad because you did something bad? She was scared something bad might happen. That's different from mad, even when it sounds the same. They walked the rest of the block together, Jasper counting porch lights out loud. Some still burning from the night before, most now dark in the gray morning. One flickering weakly on a timer that needed a new bulb, something Declan mentally filed away to fix on his next pass. It was a small, ordinary ritual, and it was the only part of his day that still felt like it belonged entirely to him. 3 houses down, an elderly man lifted a hand from his window. Declan lifted his back. Neither of them said a word. It was enough. Some mornings Mr. Bickford cracked the door open just enough to call out a weather report nobody had asked for. Storm swinging north by Thursday, you'll want your good gloves. And Declan would call back a thank you and keep moving, because the old man's real message was never about the weather at all. It was, I saw you. I'm still here. Carry on. 2 doors past the Bickford house, Rosalind Pratt was standing on her own newly cleared walk in slippers, holding a mug of coffee she hadn't managed to drink yet, watching Declan work the last stretch of the block with something like disbelief on her face. You did this? She asked. All of it? I moved in 6 weeks ago, and I genuinely thought the city still ran a full crew. Used to, Declan said. Not anymore. So who's paying you? Nobody's paying me. He nodded at his son, trudging along with the coffee can. This is Jasper. He helps most mornings. Rosalind looked between the 2 of them, then down at her own driveway, clear all the way to the mailbox. I've got 2 kids and a job that starts at 7. I would not have made it out of here without hitting black ice if you hadn't done this. That's the whole idea. Can I at least pay you for gas? Something? You can wave when you see us coming? That's the payment. He was already moving toward the next house. Community works better as a verb than as a transaction, in my experience. She stood there a moment longer, coffee going cold in her hand, watching a stranger disappear down the block with his son, and then went inside and told her husband they needed to start clearing their own steps early from now on so somebody else wouldn't have to. It was a small thing. It didn't make the news, didn't change any policy, didn't fix anything, actually broken in Thornberry's budget. But days later, when the cease and desist letter arrived and Declan had to stop, Rosalind Pratt was one of the first neighbors who started clearing her own walk before dawn, quietly filling in the gap he'd left, without ever quite understanding why it had opened in the first place. Naomi Doran hadn't planned on driving out during the worst of the next storm, but she'd been the one fielding the emergency calls that came into City Hall's after-hours line. And somewhere around 9 o'clock, a name jumped out of the call log that she recognized from her own private folder. Bernard Coates, 79, 31 years with Public Works before he retired, calling to report that he'd fallen twice already trying to get his own front steps clear and that his daughter, the only family he had, was stuck 2 states away in weather just as bad. "There's nobody I can send," the dispatcher told Naomi, apologetic, overwhelmed. "Both plows are already out on emergency routes. It could be hours before anyone's free." "Give me the address," Naomi said, already reaching for her coat. "Sure. You're the chief of staff, Naomi. That's not your job tonight." "Then whose is it?" She was already halfway to the door. "Give me the address." She drove out in the same heels and blazer she'd worn to the 6 o'clock budget meeting, parked crooked against the curb because the storm had erased every lane marking in town, and spent 45 minutes on her hands and knees with a garden shovel she found in Bernard's garage, clearing a path from his door to the street wide enough that an ambulance could reach him if it ever needed to. "You didn't have to come yourself," Bernard said, watching her from the doorway, embarrassed and grateful in the particular way proud men are both those things at once. "Nobody else was coming," Naomi said, not looking up from the shovel. "That's usually when somebody has to." Bernard watched her work for a while in silence, then said, 31 years I did exactly what you're doing right now, except it was my job description instead of a decision you made at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday." "I doesn't feel that different from here," Naomi said. "It's not, really. That's sort of the tragedy of the whole thing." He shifted his weight against the doorframe. "Somebody decided my job wasn't essential enough to keep funding 6 deep. I'd like to know what they'd call essential, if not this." Naomi didn't have a good answer for him, mostly because it was a question she'd been asking her own boss for 8 months without getting one back. "You're going to ruin that nice coat." "It's already ruined. I decided that about 10 minutes ago." She kept working, breath ragged in the cold. "You worked 31 years for this city. The least this city can do is get you to your own front door in one piece." She didn't tell anyone at City Hall about it the next morning. It wasn't the kind of thing you put on a report. But she added Bernard Coates' name to her private folder anyway, in the column she privately labeled the ones we forgot, right underneath a name she'd written there 8 months earlier, D. Morrow. The complaint reached the city attorney's desk 4 days after the driveway confrontation, filed not by Adrian, but by a neighbor 2 doors down from the Colfax house who'd watched the whole exchange from her window and decided, with the particular zeal of someone bored on a snow day, that a man running heavy equipment on private property without authorization was a liability the city needed to address before somebody got hurt and sued everyone in sight. "I need you to send a cease and desist," the city attorney told Adrian, sliding a draft letter across her desk. "Today, ideally. If this man plows a driveway and someone falls on ice he missed. The city could be named in the suit for failing to act once it had notice. We can't unknow what your neighbor reported." "He's not doing anything to the city's benefit or on the city's behalf," Adrian said, reading the letter twice. "He's a private citizen clearing snow out of his own pocket, on municipal right-of-way with unlicensed equipment, after the city received a formal written complaint. That's exactly the fact pattern that gets a town sued into the ground." The attorney tapped the page twice for emphasis. "This isn't about whether what he's doing is kind, Mayor. It's about what happens the day it isn't enough." Naomi, sitting in on the meeting, said nothing for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Do we at least know who this man is before we send it?" "Does it matter who he is?" the attorney asked. "It might," Naomi said, and nobody in the room, including her, understood yet how much it would. "Then find out," Naomi pressed. "Give me until end of day. If this is some kid pulling a prank with his father's snowblower, fine, send the letter. But if it's something else, I'd rather we knew before we put the city's name on a threat." "So, we don't have until end of day," the attorney said. "We have until the next storm, and the forecast says that's Thursday." Adriana looked between them, torn in a way she didn't let show on her face. "Send it," Adrian said finally, because the legal exposure was real, and because signing letters had become the only language she knew how to speak when a decision made her uneasy. $350 per violation, it read. "Effective immediately, and cease all unauthorized snow removal activity on public and private property within city limits until further notice." She told herself it was the only defensible decision available to her, and some cold, careful part of her almost believed it. The letter went out that same afternoon, and within a week the story had traveled the particular way small-town news travels, y'all. Not through any newspaper, but through the grocery store checkout line, the elementary school pickup loop, the hardware store counter where half of Halden Street bought its salt. People took sides quickly and mostly quietly, the way people do about things they feel strongly about but don't want to be seen fighting over. A few residents called City Hall to complain that the mayor was punishing a good Samaritan. A few others, privately relieved to no longer feel obligated to wave and say thank you to a stranger with a snowblower, said nothing at all. Adriana heard both kinds of silence and mistook them, for a while, for the matter being settled. She did not yet know the man's name was Declan Morrow. She would learn it 4 days later, in the worst possible way. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by a city clerk who looked almost as uncomfortable as Declan felt reading it. $350 a violation, he read aloud to no one, standing in his own kitchen. Jasper looked up from his homework at the table. What's a violation, Dad? It means somebody decided what I've been doing is a problem instead of a help. He set the letter down carefully, the way you set down something you're trying not to crumple in your fist. So I guess I'm not allowed to plow the street anymore. But what about the porch lights? I don't know, bud. He caught himself. I don't know yet, Jasper. Mom would have hated that letter, Jasper said later that night, finding his father still awake at the kitchen table near midnight, staring at the paper like it might rearrange itself into something survivable. Yeah, Declan said. She would have. Why do people make rules against nice things? Sometimes the rule isn't really against the nice thing. It's against something that went wrong somewhere else, and the nice thing just happened to be standing in the way. He rubbed his face. Doesn't make it feel any different, though. Are you going to stop? He didn't answer right away. I think I have to, for now. Jasper considered this with the flat seriousness of a child weighing something much larger than he had words for. Then who's going to watch the lights? Declan didn't have a good answer for that either. The 3 days that followed were the hardest kind of quiet. The kind where nothing happened, and every hour of nothing happening feels like a small betrayal. He drove past Mr. Bickford's house on the way to drop Jasper at school and saw the old man's steps unshoveled for the first time in 2 winters and had to grip the wheel and keep driving instead of pulling over. He passed Rosalind Pratt scraping her own windshield with a credit card because she didn't own an ice scraper yet, and lifted a hand in apology. He didn't have words to explain. You could just do our house, Jasper suggested on the second night, hopeful in the specific way kids are hopeful about loopholes. The letter's only about other people's driveways, right? The letter's about all of it, bud. I checked twice. Declan ruffled his son's hair, more to comfort himself than Jasper. Doesn't feel right doing less than everybody. Anyway, either the whole street gets looked after or none of it does. That was always the deal I made. Who'd you make the deal with? He didn't have an easy answer for that one either. Not one an 8-year-old could carry. So he just said, somebody who isn't here to hold me to it anymore, which somehow makes it matter more, not less. He still didn't have a better answer 3 days later, when the storm the forecasters had been quietly watching all week finally arrived and turned out to be worse than any of their models had predicted. It came in off the river just after dusk, low and fast, the kind of system old-timers in Thornbury still measured other storms against for years afterward. 22 inches fell in under 18 hours. Power failed on half of Halden Street by 9 o'clock, then spread block by block through the rest of town as transformers gave out under the weight of ice nobody had budgeted the crews to clear in time. Adriana Colfax spent that storm exactly where she'd spent every storm since taking office, at her desk in City Hall, coordinating emergency response with a phone in each hand, half listening to a radio scanner that crackled with calls faster than anyone could log them. Her mother, Eloise, was 74 and had lived alone on Halden Street since Gareth Colfax died, refusing every suggestion that she move somewhere smaller, somewhere managed, somewhere Adrian could stop worrying about her from a distance. Adrian called her at 8, at 9, at 9:40, each time getting the same brisk reassurance. I'm fine, dear. I've got soup on. Go do your job. Mom, the power's out on half the street. Call me the second it comes back. I raised you in worse storms than this one. Go do your job. At 10:15, the porch light on Eloise's house went dark, and nobody in City Hall knew it, because there was no line item, no call log, no emergency channel that tracked a single porch light on a residential street. Only one person in Thornbury was watching for it. Declan had promised himself he wouldn't go out that night. The letter was $350 a violation, and he had exactly enough saved to make it 2 more months without panicking about groceries, and every rational calculation said stay home, stay legal, stay safe. He stood at his own front window for 11 minutes watching the storm and losing an argument with himself that he'd actually already lost the moment he made a promise at a funeral 2 years earlier. Dad! Jasper was standing behind him in pajamas, wide awake despite the hour. The Colfax house light's not on. Declan hadn't told his son he'd been counting that particular light every night since the confrontation. Half out of habit, half out of something he couldn't quite name. He hadn't realized Jasper had started counting it too. Stay here, Declan said, already reaching for his coat. Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anybody but me. What about the letter? Some rules cost less to break than others. He was already halfway out the door. This is one of those nights. Jasper sat at the kitchen window for the next 20 minutes, knees pulled to his chest, watching the storm swallow his father's taillights at the end of the block, and then nothing at all. He counted in his head the way his father had taught him without meaning to. 1 house, 2 houses, 3. Trying to guess how far Declan had gotten by how long it had been. A small private ritual of his own that he never told anyone about, not even years later. The house creaked around him in the wind. The power flickered once and held. He did not cry, because some part of him understood, in the wordless way children understand large things, that this was not a night for crying yet, only for waiting, and that waiting was its own kind of work. He found Eloise Colfax on her own front walk, 20 feet from her porch, exactly where Fiona had gone down 2 winters earlier, in exactly the kind of storm that erased the difference between ice and shadow until it was too late to tell them apart. She was conscious, barely, disoriented from the cold, one arm bent wrong beneath her, snow already collecting in the folds of her coat. She'd gone out to bring in firewood when the power failed and never made it back. "Ma'am, I've got you. Stay still. Don't try to move that arm." Declan was on his knees in the snow beside her before he'd consciously decided to move, phone already against his ear. The 911 dispatcher's voice thin and staticky through a connection the storm kept threatening to drop. "I need an ambulance on Halden Street. Elderly female, fall injury, possible fracture. She's been out here." He looked at his watch, did the math, felt his stomach drop. "At least 20 minutes, maybe longer." "Units are delayed, sir. We've got multiple calls stacked across the whole." "I understand you're delayed. I'm not going anywhere. Just get somebody here as fast as you can." He pulled off his own coat, the way he had 1,000 times in his old life clearing other people's driveways, and laid it over Eloise's shoulders and kept talking to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The snow, her garden, anything to keep her present, because it was the only thing he knew how to do with his hands shaking this badly. "Cold," Eloise managed, teeth chattering. "So cold, young man." "I know. Help's coming. You're not alone out here. I promise you that." He glanced toward the dark porch. "Soon as they get you inside, we're flipping that light back on. Deal?" She almost smiled. "Deal." Adrienne arrived 11 minutes later, having left City Hall the second the call crossed the emergency channel and heard her mother's address attached to it, driving faster than the roads should have allowed, arriving to find a man kneeling in her mother's front yard in his shirt sleeves, his own coat wrapped around Eloise, snow collecting in his hair. She recognized him instantly. The driveway, the snowblower, the porch light. Her mind reached for the memory before her mouth could catch up. The argument in this exact spot, the man's calm insistence, the words that hadn't made sense to her a week ago and now explained everything happening in front of her. "You," she said, and it came out broken in half. Not accusation, just disbelief. "She's cold, but she's talking," Declan said, not looking up. "Ambulance is 6 minutes out. I need you to hold her hand and keep her talking. She trusts your voice better than mine." Adrienne had dropped to her knees in the snow without a second's hesitation, taking her mother's hand, saying her name over and over in a voice that cracked on the second syllable every time. "Stay with me, Mom. Look at me, not the sky. Look at me." Adrienne's voice, so controlled in every council meeting, in every budget hearing, came apart completely out here in the snow, and she didn't try to stop it. "You are not doing this. Not tonight. Not on my watch." "I'm trying, dear," Eloise managed. "I'm trying." The ambulance arrived. The paramedics worked fast and careful, and as they lifted Eloise onto the gurney, wrapped now in a proper blanket, someone, Declan never found out who, whether it was instinct or accident, flipped the porch light switch beside the front door, and the yellow glow came back on over an empty walk, steady, the way it always had been, the way it was supposed to be. Adrienne stood in the snow staring at that light like it had said something to her directly. Declan stood a few feet away, his own coat gone, arms wrapped around himself in the cold, watching the same light with the specific silent grief of a man who had once stood exactly this close to exactly this kind of ending and lost. "That's why you were in my mother's driveway," Adrienne said quietly. "It was never about her specifically. It's about the light." "It's about all of them," Declan said. "She just happened to be one of them tonight." Neither of them cried yet. That came later, separately, in different rooms. By the next morning, the story had already found its way past the grocery line and the school pickup loop and into something closer to a headline. A paramedic who'd been on scene mentioned it to a cousin who worked at the Gazette, and by noon there was a reporter calling City Hall asking whether it was true that the mayor's own cease and desist letter had nearly cost her mother's life. Naomi fielded 3 of those calls herself before lunch and answered each one the same careful way. No comment yet. A full statement to follow. Privately, she thought the story deserved to run exactly as ugly as the truth actually was, and said as much to Adrian that afternoon, gently, in a hallway neither of them wanted to be standing in twice in 1 week. Eloise Colfax spent 3 nights in the hospital with a broken wrist and a mild concussion and was, everyone agreed, lucky. 20 more minutes in that cold and the story would have ended differently. Adrian sat in the hospital hallway near midnight after the second night, staring at nothing, and found Declan there too, having driven over on his own with no reason to except that he wanted to know Eloise had made it through the surgery on her wrist okay. "I looked up your file," Adrian said, not looking at him at first. "Declan Morrow, 19 years with Public Works, laid off 8 months ago in the seasonal cuts." She finally turned. "I signed that layoff. I don't remember your name specifically because I didn't let myself remember any of the names. That was easier." "I know," Declan said. "I've thought about that a lot since your letter showed up. About which parts of a budget are actually numbers, and which parts are just people somebody decided not to look at too closely. My father died because a piece of equipment this town wouldn't pay to replace failed on him." Adrian's voice was low, and it came out of her like something finally given permission to exist out loud. 22 years ago, I built an entire career out of making sure Thornberry never again decided maintenance was optional. And somewhere in there, I turned into exactly the kind of administration that decides people are optional instead. "I'm not looking for an apology," Declan said. "I don't think that's actually what fixes this." "You could at least let me try," Adrian said, something brittle in her voice. "I've apologized. That's not nothing." "It's not nothing. It's also not enough, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't still be sitting in this hallway at midnight instead of going home." He wasn't unkind, saying it, just direct. "An apology costs you a sentence. I'd like to see what you're actually willing to spend." "Then what does?" she asked again, quieter this time. "You reverse the cease and desist. You put together an actual contract, paid, real hours, a real truck, for storm response, and you hire people who lost their jobs the last time this city decided being careful with money meant being careless with people." He met her eyes. "Not because you feel bad about my kid, or my late wife, or tonight, because the work is necessary and you finally noticed it is." Adriana was quiet long enough that the hospital hallway's fluorescent hum became the only sound between them. "You realize what you're asking is harder than an apology. An apology I could manage tonight, in this hallway, and mean every word of it. What you're describing means fighting my own finance director for weeks, maybe losing that fight in the end." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Declan said. "I've spent 2 years doing the hard thing nobody was watching. I don't see why you should get to skip it just because people are finally paying attention." "That's a boundary," Adrian said, something almost like respect moving across her tired face. "It's the only kind of sorry I know how to believe," Declan said. "Words are easy, Mayor. I've had a letter from your office already. I'd like to see what you actually build instead." It took 3 weeks, not 3 days, for the paperwork to move. "So, you want to reverse a cost-saving decision and add a maintenance line the department didn't ask for, based on one bad night," the finance director said in the first committee meeting where Naomi presented the proposal. "That's not policy. That's an emotional overcorrection." "It's not based on one bad night," Naomi said. "It's based on 8 months of a folder I've been keeping on my own time, of every person this cut actually touched and what happened to each of them. I can read you all 31 names if the committee has the stomach for it. Nobody's disputing it was a hard year for some people. Some people, 19-year employees, a woman who nearly froze in her own front yard." Naomi didn't raise her voice, but she didn't back down either. "I signed those layoff letters because it was my job. I am not going to sit here and watch this get filed away as an unfortunate exception. It's the actual result of the actual decision. Own it or don't put my name on the next one." She walked out of that meeting without a vote, and out of the next one 2 weeks later with a delayed vote. And it took a public hearing where Bernard Coates stood up unprompted, cane in hand, and told the whole council about a chief of staff who'd shoveled his steps herself in the middle of the worst storm of the year without being asked, which did more to move 3 swing votes than any spreadsheet Naomi had prepared in 8 months of trying. "You want to talk about what this city can and can't afford," Bernard told the council, his voice shaking slightly but not stopping. "I gave this town 31 years. The night I needed it back, it was a woman in heels with a garden shovel who showed up, not a budget line. Whatever it costs to make sure that's not luck next time, pay it." Rosalind Pratt spoke after him, holding a piece of paper with notes she barely glanced at. I didn't know this man's name for 6 weeks. I just knew my driveway was clear every time I needed it to be, and then one day it wasn't, and I understood for the first time what this council actually voted to take away. She looked directly at Adrian. You don't need to feel guilty about it anymore. You need to fix it. Those aren't the same request. The council voted 7-2 to fund the new contract in full. Declan didn't accept the first offer they put in front of him. It read too much like an apology with a paycheck attached, a single seasonal contract sized just for him, quietly worded so nobody would have to explain the optics of the story that had made the local paper. He sent it back with 2 changes: a real funded 4-person seasonal crew instead of one symbolic hire, and a formal budget line for equipment maintenance that couldn't be quietly redirected the next time the town got nervous about money. You're negotiating against a woman trying to give you your job back, the finance director said, incredulous, in the meeting where Declan laid out the counteroffer himself. I'm not negotiating for me, Declan said. I already know how to survive on nothing. I'm negotiating so the next 4 people this happens to don't have to find out the hard way like I did. Adrian signed it without further resistance. It cost more than the original cut had saved, and the finance director noted as much in the margin of the final draft, not as an objection exactly, just a fact somebody needed to have on record. Adrian read the note, initialed beside it anyway, and told him plainly that some facts were worth the number attached to them. It wasn't a clean victory. The town's budget was still tight, the college satellite campus still needed a roof repair nobody had funded, and Adrian still lay awake some nights doing arithmetic that never quite balanced. But for the first time in 16 months, the arithmetic had a name in it instead of just a number, and that, she was starting to understand, was the actual job. Spring came the way it always does after a hard winter. Unhurried, unremarkable, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Declan Morrow drove a city plow again that following November, this time on the books, this time with 3 other drivers rotating shifts he no longer had to fund out of his own pocket. Halden Street still got the whole block treatment after every storm, but now there was a second truck some nights and a rotating list of neighbors who'd started clearing their own front steps early just to lighten the load, which was, Declan privately thought, exactly the kind of change that couldn't have been written into any contract. Eloise Colfax kept the porch light on year-round now, storm or no storm, and told anyone who asked that it wasn't superstition, it was gratitude with a light bulb attached. Adrian visited most Sundays, something she hadn't managed more than once a month before that winter, and the 2 of them had taken, without discussing it, to standing on the porch together before Adrian drove home, watching the street go dark, house by house. Jasper still counted porch lights on the walk to school, out loud, a habit his father had stopped trying to break him of. One Sunday in early spring, Adrian found Jasper sitting on his grandmother's porch steps, waiting for his father to finish a cup of coffee with Eloise inside, and sat down next to him without quite planning to. Do you still count them? She asked. The lights? Every night. Jasper considered her for a moment with the frank, unguarded assessment only children manage. You're the mayor who yelled at my dad. I am, Adrian said. I'm also the mayor who fixed it, eventually. Grandma says eventually still counts. Jasper swung his feet, thinking it over. Why did it take you so long? She didn't give him a politician's answer, because something about the directness of the question made that feel impossible. Because I was so afraid of making one kind of mistake that I didn't notice I was making a different one, she said. Does that make sense? Kind of. He nodded slowly. My dad says the ice doesn't care why the driveway didn't get cleared. It just cares that it didn't. Adriana laughed for what felt like the first time in months, surprised by the sound of it. Your dad's smarter than most of my council. He usually is, Jasper said, entirely without irony, and went back to counting porch lights down the block. Bernard Coates got a standing invitation to Sunday dinner at the Morrow House that he accepted more often than not, and had started without anyone quite noticing when it began, showing Jasper how to keep an engine running through a bad winter. Naomi Doran kept her private folder, though these days it had started filling with different kinds of names. What denied to see a to know? People the new policy had actually helped. Entries she read over sometimes on hard days, proof that a system could be built to notice people instead of erasing them. She'd been offered a larger role in a neighboring town's administration that spring, better pay, a cleaner org chart, and had turned it down without much deliberation. Somebody has to keep the folder here, she told Adrian, only half joking, and Adrian had stopped arguing with her about it. None of it undid what the ice had taken. Declan still missed his wife every single day, in the particular quiet way grief settles into permanent residence rather than ever fully leaving. There were still mornings he reached for the phone to tell her something before remembering. Still nights the empty side of the bed felt wider than physics should allow. Grief hadn't gotten smaller, he had simply gotten more practiced at carrying it while still doing everything else a life required. But some nights now, walking Halden Street after a storm, he'd look down the block and see 6, 8, 10 porch lights burning steady against the dark, and understand that the promise he'd made at a funeral 2 years ago had somehow, without his permission, become something the whole street carried together. A porch light doesn't ask who's coming home. It just stays on. It had, this time, been enough to bring everyone back inside.